So I look in the room and thanks everybody for being here. And probably a fair question is, what am I doing here? Well, I went to high school right down the road here, Washington Lee High School. So I'm in my old stomping grounds. And then you say, well, how did you end up? Yeah, I can't change. But then you say, well, how did you end up in the Army? Well, my father was in the Army, and my father's father was in the Army. And my 4 brothers were in the Army, and my sister married a soldier. And then when it was time for me to get married, I married the daughter of a career soldier. Her 3 brothers were soldiers. Her sister is the widow of a guy who I served with. So you kind of get it. It was all about the Army. It wasn't a question of you going in the service. It was a question of what branch of the Army you were going into. But when I think about the Army and I look around this room, and there are a number of people in this room that I had the honor of serving with or serving under or knowing about, you say, okay, what is it about the Army that makes you feel connected to it? Is it those big decisions you might have had a small part in making? Is it the war stories? Is it the things like that, the jobs that you may have had that were special? And that's not what I remember. What I remember is people. What I remember is Steve Cuffey, my old battalion sergeant major in the 82nd Airborne Division. What I remember is John Agolia, my battalion S4 when I was the A Company commander. He was a total pain in the ass. And the IG was coming, you know, he was rah, 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 rah. But the reality is, those are the people you love. I mean, that's what the Army's about. The Army's not about warfare. The Army's not about any of the other things that makes it connective for us. It's about the people that you love. And when you understand that, it suddenly has this special resonance for me, and I think for other people. Tonight's talk is probably going to be different from what some of you may expect or what you typically see. It starts with a creepy picture of a guy in a G-string. And you're saying right now, where is this going? Well, in reality, I grew up with that picture. I grew up with the concept that that picture conveyed. And it came from a book. I still have this book. It's sort of beat up now. It was published in 1929. And it was given to a young girl in Chattanooga, Tennessee, by her father, and she became my mother. When I was young, she read it to me. Greek and Roman heroes. When I got a son, I read it to my son. Recently, I started reading it to my oldest granddaughter, because it's all about leaders. But if you look at the picture and you say, well, what does it mean? This was Atlas standing on top of what are now called the Atlas Mountains, holding up the sky. And you say, well, that's preposterous. But actually, for many, many years, absent another explanation for why you could take a rock, drop it from your hand, and it would fall, but the sky didn't fall, people had to have an explanation on why the sky stayed up. And the explanation they came up with was there was a very strong guy who put the sky on his shoulders and held it there faithfully. Seems preposterous, but it's the basis of myth. Myths explain those things we can't otherwise explain. And often when we want to think about what happens in life and what we admire, what we believe in, and the leaders that we feel strongly about, we focus on individuals, on faces, on histories, on reputations. And when we really think ambitiously about ourselves, we see ourselves as maybe fitting in that. So I went through a career, more by luck than anything else, and that's what anybody who gets senior will admit to you. You end up in a position where you are part of things that are significant history. So when I left my career in the summer of 2010 and wrote my memoirs, I started the process of trying to get my arms and mind around my story. You started, how hard can it be? It's a memoir, it's my story. I was there. But then as we began to work on it, I had a young man, a recent Yale graduate, work with me. We did more than 100 interviews of people in the military to ask about events that I had been a part of and intended to relate. And we found something that was a bit disturbing. The first was, my memory was pretty good. Most of the things that I was a part of and I wanted to talk about, I remembered. My facts were generally right, but they were stunningly incomplete. There would be an action for which I had been involved and I might have made a decision or had an input, and then there would be an outcome and I'd get credit or blame for that. But when we actually did all the backstory with all the interviews, we found that I may have made a decision, then 1,000 things happened by countless other people that often had much more to do with the outcome than anything I did. And so what I began to realize was, even in my own story, I'm actually not the star of the show. I'm just part of it. Even my own story is as much myth as reality. Now, at times when people come to you and tell you how great you are, you don't admit that. You just go, hey, thanks. But the reality is, when you study it hard, that's a conclusion. That's the only conclusion I could arrive at. And so I started thinking about, all right, if my own life is as much myth as reality, how do I think about all the leaders that I'd thought about through my life? I'd had a number of many significant military leaders who'd done great things, who I had idolized and at times tried to emulate. Sometimes it might be the person who was the victor, but in reality, for me, it was actually the guy who lost. It was the loser in the picture, General Robert E. Lee. When I was a young lieutenant, my wife Annie bought me a fake painting. It actually was a print of this particular painting, and then it had been painted over with clear acrylic to look like a painting. Framed, it cost $25, but on second lieutenant pay, that was significant expenditure. We hung it in every set of quarters we lived in for 40 years. And I liked it because, one, it was the guy that I'd grown up near his boyhood home. I'd gone to the high school named for him. I'd followed him 100+ years later to West Point. And when people came into my house or I saw this picture, it symbolized what I wanted to be. I couldn't be Robert E. Lee, but I would like to be somewhat in the shadow, as much like him as I could be. And when people came to my house, I liked what it signaled. I liked that it signaled to people very quietly that these are the kind of values that I admire. Then in the spring of 2017, Annie came to me and she says, I think you ought to take that picture down. And I said, no, you gave it to me, honey. She says, nope. I think you better take it down. Why? Charlottesville had just happened. She says, I think it symbolizes something you don't believe in. And I said, well, I don't believe in it. General Robert E. Lee didn't believe in it. She says, doesn't matter. When people come in our house, they don't know that. We argued for about a month. She wore me down, and then on a Sunday morning, I took it off the wall, took it out to the trash, and threw it away. Wasn't easy. Robert E. Lee wasn't just a man, just a West Point graduate, a perfect cadet, one of 6 cadets to never get a single demerit, something I didn't achieve. Can you imagine anybody described that way? And yet this isn't the most over-the-top quote about Robert E. Lee. It's humbling just to read. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, General Lee went from being a beaten commander to becoming an icon. More statues of Robert E. Lee in the United States, to include many in the North, than of anyone else. Extraordinary symbology to a person who actually, if he was in the room today, would be the most impressive guy in the room. Charismatic, upright, driven by values. But the reality is, as I studied him further, and I thought more about him, and I stopped saying, well, he lost the Civil War, but that's okay. Then I focused on the fact that actually in the spring of 1861, he'd made the decision to violate his oath that he made on the plain at West Point, fight against his nation, who attempted to divide it, and he did it in defense of slavery. And suddenly I couldn't square that anymore. And I ended up in a different place with him. Now, I don't hate Robert E. Lee now. I still admire a lot about Robert E. Lee. But I think that he got it wrong. At a critical moment in life, he forgot who he was. That doesn't make him evil, it makes him human. Makes him flawed. Makes him just like me. Makes him just like most of us in this room. And suddenly leadership becomes something we may think a little differently about. John F. Kennedy talked about the myth, the power of mythology, because it starts to become our reality. And as we think about leaders, the great man theory and other ideas about leadership, we're often guided by something that we wish was true. As Carter mentioned, I'd written 2 books before this. I'd written my memoirs, and then I'd written a book called Team of Teams about organizational leadership and teamwork. But I got to age 63, and I came to the conclusion I didn't really understand leadership. Now, that's pretty humbling. I'd been taught leadership. I'd had a chance to practice it. I'd worked for some pretty impressive leaders, and I got to that point in my life and come to the conclusion I had a basic misunderstanding about what leadership actually is. And so we went on a journey to try to see if we could figure it out for ourselves. I have 2 co-authors on this, a former Navy SEAL and a former Marine Corps infantryman. And so we went back to first principles. We went to a first century biographer named Plutarch. Now, all of us know Plutarch by name. You can say, Plutarch, yep. Almost none of us have read it. I now have read all 1,000 pages, but I hadn't before. But if we were here 75 years ago, we all would have read it. Theodore Roosevelt carried it in his breast pocket, said he read it 1,000 times and it was forever fresh. Alexander Hamilton, at night at Valley Forge as a young captain, took notes on it, was reading it and took notes on the profiles. And the 46 leaders that were profiled in the book became the first biographies. And it set a pathway on how we think about leaders, how we study them, how we record their history. And Plutarch became the standard, which for millennia, almost 2 millennia, really divined that. So we decided to take a new look, to try to use Plutarch's model to profile a series of leaders. We ended up with a baker's dozen, 6 pairs in different genre, and then 1 standalone. And we looked at 13 leaders, but instead of just looking at leaders, what we came out with is there's a mythology about leaders. There's a mythology that we hold on to. And then there's a reality. And this isn't an expose. It's an understanding that that mythology resides in our mind. So the 3 leaders that took it on went on this journey to try to figure it out. And of course, we're going to take on a number of leaders. 3 former military officers who we likely to profile. And this is who most people thought we would profile, or some version of this. We actually took a very different take. We took Leonard Bernstein, Albert Einstein, Coco Chanel. I didn't even know she was a person when we started this. Now I've written a book about her. I'm actually very proud of that. Margaret Thatcher. What we wanted to do was look at leadership across a number of fields, diversity in the line of work they were in their sex, in their nationality, in the ages in which they operated, not to see what are the common 2 or 3 things that make a leader great, but to understand why did they emerge as leaders? What was unique about them or special about them that emerged? Look at an orchestra play, perfect teamwork. Produces this incredible melody. Look at the conductor controlling them with a single baton. When we think of orchestras, what do we typically think of? The conductor. If you go back to the 1950s or 60s or early 70s and look up symphony music, Boston Pops, New York Philharmonic, almost always the cover of the album is the conductor. And they're not playing an instrument. And in fact, until about 150 years ago, there was no conductor. An orchestra would get together and it was a group of equals. Nobody conducted them. No orchestra was going to give someone that control over them. And then you started to have the rise of a conductor, and then the evil addition of the baton. And that was considered at the beginning this symbol of power, that you were dominating this orchestra, and it was much resented. But as concert halls got bigger, it was necessary because the sound traveled, obviously, different distances. They needed the baton to keep people in time. And suddenly the baton became a coordination tool, but also a symbol of power or a symbol of control. And where orchestras, we know that the orchestra produces the music, they are the music. How often do we start to think, actually the conductor equals the music? Most of us grew up thinking about leadership. We say, what is leadership? How does it work? Typically we say, well, it begins with the leader. Then the leader has this quality or qualities, behaviors, or powers of leadership that they then apply to the followers and to the context of the situation. And if it's good, they produce an outcome. The dominant variable, obviously, in the model is the leader. Get a good leader, get a good outcome. Get a bad leader, get a bad outcome. But as we studied it, we went into the mythology, we really found that this is how we think leadership actually works. You have followers, the context of the situation, and leaders, and it's an interaction. It's a constant interaction. It's intensely contextual. The leader may not be the most important variable here, and it's always different. Statistically, if you go to a company and take a very successful CEO, pull them out, parachute them in another company, they are less successful than if you promote someone from inside the company. And how do we explain that? We say, well, we moved Susan from that company to this company, and she lost her edge. Or old Joe just didn't have a good day when they went to the new company. The reality is, what's right in one context of one moment can be completely wrong for another. And that can even be true in the same organization in different periods of time. So the leadership actually is an emergent property that comes out of this interaction. Now you say, now wait a minute, that's harder because now the leadership is much more difficult to get your arms around and control. That's exactly the point. The people who emerge as leaders are really part of this complex interaction that's far more difficult to predict and control than we like to believe it is. In 2003, I was sent to Iraq. And I commanded Joint Special Operations Command, the counter-terrorist forces for the United States. Our opponent, we realized by the fall of 2003, for al-Qaeda in Iraq was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a young Jordanian. By October 2003, Iraq was becoming a grim place. What it looked like it might be straightforward in the spring of 2003 had begun to sink into this abyss, sort of this post-apocalyptic level of violence in which Iraqis were paying the major bill. But the reality is, the place was getting worse and worse. Now, part of it was driven by this cancer metastasizing in Iraq that became known ultimately as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Inside all the chaotic violence that was largely disorganized initially, you had the appearance of a pretty professional terrorist organization. If you wanted to find its history, it eventually took its name from Al-Qaeda, which was founded in 1988 in Pakistan by Osama bin Laden. But in reality, the leader came out of this place, a prison in Jordan. What had happened is Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was a young man, misspent youth, got involved in petty crime. He was a bully. He got a bunch of tattoos. His mother got worried about him, so she sent him to more fundamentalist school. That got him more focused. Eventually went to Afghanistan to try to join the jihad against the Soviets, but he got there too late. The Soviets were already pulling out. He did fight against the remnant government under President Najibullah, and he got blooded, and he came back to Jordan after several years convinced that he wanted to be a mujahideen, or holy warrior. Now, he started his own terrorist group to fight the government of Jordan, but it was amateurish at the beginning. They sent one operative to a pornographic movie to set off a bomb. He went in with the bomb. He sat down. He set the bomb. He got entranced by the movie. He sat there and it blew his legs off. They got wrapped up by the Jordanian police, security services, and Zarqawi was thrown in prison. Now this young tough who's not very well educated finds himself in prison. And what happens is he finds out he can be more pious, more disciplined, more focused, more charismatic than other people in that prison. He doesn't have the intellectual background, the religious education to hold his own in religious arguments, but he can be more of a devout believer than anybody else. The tattoos of his youth he considers haram or a violation. So he tries to remove them with bleach. When he can't do that, he has a razor blade smuggled in, and he slices the tattoos off. And he does it very openly so that other prisoners can see it. So they can see, I am walking the walk. I have this zealous belief in our cause that I'm willing to live to. And it becomes magnetic for the other prisoners. He becomes the leader inside the prison. He doles out discipline. He talks to the leadership, the guard force of the prison. They sort of let him do what he wants to do because he's proven he has the moral force from this zealotry. He gets into Iraq and he forms Al-Qaeda in Iraq. He dresses the part. He looks like a terrorist leader. This is a propaganda video they were making. We captured it online before they could put it out. And Abu Musab al-Zarqawi is a very effective leader. He travels around the country. He gives guidance. He personally accepts great risk. He personally beheads Nicholas Berg and some other detainees that they had, not because he just loved to cut people's heads off, but because he knew it shows that he's willing to do whatever it takes. He's willing to be whatever is required to be effective. And again, it's magnetic. Many of the people who joined Al-Qaeda in Iraq and followed Abu Musab al-Zarqawi didn't believe with his fervor. But if you think of that kind of leader, have you ever been around someone who's so confident, so convicted, so convinced, so willing to walk into anything that we find ourselves following them? If they're so sure, well, what the heck? Zarqawi is the godfather of ISIS. If you talk to ISIS today, they don't talk about Osama bin Laden. They talk about Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He was killed in 2006. And I remember we killed him in June, brought his body down. I stood over it right after it happened. I wasn't sad he was dead. But the reality was, even at that point, I had a pretty healthy respect for the guy. I could completely disagree with his cause and his methods, but I had to admire his commitment, his skill, his effectiveness. He was willing to die for his cause. Who's to say that I'd been born in the industrial town of Zark, I wouldn't have ended up there, and he where I was. And so you have somebody like this who comes along, and we have to ask ourselves, why is it we become entranced? And then why can't they remain? Why do they tend to fade away? We also profile Maximilien de Robespierre of the French Revolution. And we find that he also was a zealot who burned so bright that he pulled people along with him. But it was unsustainable. Like a flame that does that, it burned the oxygen in the room. And at a certain point of time, he's almost rejected by the environment in which he's been so effective. Then you jump to a completely different kind of person. Go to Saumur, rural France in 1883. A young girl is born and she's orphaned at a pretty young age, and she's sent to a convent. She learns to sew. About 30 years later, Coco Chanel has this extraordinary empire that's begun with hats, gone to fashion, and then she invents and markets a perfume that's still iconic today, Chanel No. 5. And it's number 5 because they brought her 10 samples. This one was numbered number 5. She said, that's my favorite. But it's not a simple story. It's just not a young lady with a lot of skill. It intersects with a time. We think of the female fashion at the turn of the century. It was huge. It was heavy. It was hot. It was expensive. It was constricting. It was impractical for a time in which women's movement was taking them to political involvement, into the workforce in greater numbers, and intersected with the reality that World War I had come. And now females were needed in greater numbers, but also the cost of materials drove a higher level of practicality. And so into this young girl, young lady at this point, she sees the situation and she says, times are ripe for change. And she starts to create very different fashions, very fitted fashions that were loose on her athletic body. She starts to give things that women can actually live in. And she says, I saw an opportunity. I saw conditions were ripe for change, and I took that opportunity. She was a tough leader, though. Working for Coco Chanel was difficult business. She would make female models stand for hours while she chain smoked and used them for mannequins and worked on fashion. Every morning when she showed up at the office, they had to line up on either side like an honor guard, wearing Chanel fashions as she walked in. And yet she never had trouble recruiting people, because people wanted to be part of something special. She was offering something that people wanted and needed, and she became, again, magnetic. People wanted to follow her. During the Second World War, she had an affair with a Nazi officer in Paris. She got involved in intelligence and military intelligence in ways she shouldn't, and at the end of the war, she had to leave, or she would be punished as a collaborator. Yet a decade later, she comes back, reestablishes herself in Paris, and soon all is forgiven, all is forgotten, and she continues on with what she's created, which is still an empire. An amazing person, but she also emerged from a series of factors that all existed at that point. And then we ask ourselves, what makes someone like that, again, so attractive to us, both as an employer, but also someone we want to be like. Her marketing was, be like me, be like Coco Chanel, wear the clothes I wear, live the life I live. And this is the way to do that. Almost everyone in this room will remember these words. I was 9 years old, living here in Arlington, Virginia, and on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King gave an extraordinary speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
My mother was from the South, so our family, half the family was from the deep South, and my mother was deeply involved and interested in the civil rights movement. So I was very, very aware of Dr. King, even as a 9-year-old boy. I remember those words. But we don't all remember the context. This was part of a speech called the March for Jobs and Progress that had been planned more than a year before. 250,000 people came on a warm August afternoon and stood out on the mall to listen to a series of speakers. Dr. King was the 16th speaker. He was the most famous speaker. He was the person people came to hear. He stayed up until 4 in the morning writing his remarks, so he would get it just right. He got up at the lectern and began to speak, and for 11 minutes he spoke, and he didn't really connect with his audience. They were polite, they were listening, but there wasn't an interaction. Then from behind him, a lady that he knew, a gospel singer named Mahalia Jackson, said, Martin, tell him about the dream. And he departed from the prepared text, and he went into a familiar riff he'd used times before about I have a dream. And he made American rhetorical oratory history. He connected, and that's what we remember. But the danger is when we think of Dr. Martin Luther King is that that's what we remember. We remember his eloquence. We remember the righteousness of his cause. But we ought to think a little bit more about him. Because actually, when you look closely at Dr. King, it's much more impressive. If we start, we think of the leader. In 1955, Dr. King is a 26-year-old recent graduate of his PhD program, and he's named pastor of a church in Montgomery, Alabama. And it is the beginning of a period when they decide to try to desegregate public transportation in Montgomery. He is elected leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association, even though he's new and he's young, and there are more established civil rights leaders in Montgomery. He takes control, and for 382 days, the African-American population of Montgomery conducts a boycott of public transportation to put pressure on government and businesses. Every day, people had to walk to work, carpool, or get some other way to avoid using the bus so that they could support this effort. Every week they met in churches in the evening to synchronize their movement. The leader kept them focused. The leader kept them disciplined. And after 382 days, they succeeded. But we have to remember the context of the moment. I'm old enough to remember those signs. Right now we look at them and we're just shocked. We say, that couldn't be. That never was, or that was in one small place, and that's not true. Many of you who have worked in here, have worked in the Pentagon, know just how convenient it is in the Pentagon to go to the restroom because there are so many restrooms conveniently located. There are so many restrooms in the Pentagon because it was built in Virginia and they had to have white and black restrooms. And so they built twice as many as they needed. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt found out about this in 1941, he lost his mind. But it was the law. And then the followers. We tend to think of the followers as follow Dr. King, this extraordinarily disciplined set of nonviolent followers, and it really wasn't that way. The civil rights movement was a bunch of different groups, some who wanted to be very violent, some who wanted to be nonviolent, big personalities that had been involved longer than Dr. King, who all wanted to pull it in different directions. And yet Dr. King wasn't really elected or appointed, he became the de facto leader of this effort. And you say, well, okay, there he is at the center, but what does that mean? What that really means is what Dr. Martin Luther King had to do every day for almost 13 years was this variety of tasks, some of which we'd call management, some of which we'd call leadership. And every day he did something different. One day he would be absolutely unwilling to yield to white resistance. And the next day he cuts a deal not to continue on past the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. One day people come to him and they say, we need your body, we want you to be jailed so that the movement can get the press from you being put in jail. And he has to make the decision not to do that because he has to also lead the organization. And yet he is jailed 12 times. For almost 13 years, he's the Univisor Steward, but every day it's a little different. Every day he is figuring out what's the context of the moment right now. What do my followers need right now? And he does all this before he turns 40. He's not yet 40 when in the spring of 1968 he's murdered right on that balcony at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, what's most impressive about him? A lot of things to a lot of people. Maybe most impressive to me is this larger-than-life personality who helped lead this movement. When he disappears, the movement doesn't stop. The movement actually continues. In 1990, aging Leonard Bernstein, musical genius, quirky personality, composed West Side Story, wrote classical music, led the New York Philharmonic for more than a decade. He had been this extraordinarily energetic young conductor when he burst upon the scene in 1943. But by 1990, he's older. He's not very physically active, and in fact, when he conducts, he can barely lift his hands above his waist. But he goes out to give a concert at Tanglewood in Massachusetts, and he's conducting the Boston Philharmonic. He's conducted them many times before. They're familiar with each other. They are playing together, and then he gets hit with a coughing fit. And the aging Bernstein leans over and coughs like this. He can't even stand erect. He certainly can't conduct. The music doesn't stop. The Boston Philharmonic plays as though he is still conducting them like before. In fact, there seems to be new energy in the movement, in the music, almost willing him back to his feet. This leader who they were familiar with, who temporarily had proven unable to do it, was still there. The interaction was what had mattered. He wasn't the music. Together they were the music. But leaders matter, and they matter a lot.
We must keep moving. We must keep going. If you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl, but by all means, keep moving.
Thank you very much. I'd be happy to entertain any questions you might have.
Sir, thank you for the presentation. Major Cooper, AUSA Fellow. Sir, of all the leaders profiled in your book, which one do you relate to the most and why?
Yeah, interesting. People will sometimes word that differently. I'm going to answer it a couple of ways. I would say the one I admire the most, the one if I was a chairman of board of directors, I would hire a CEO, without a doubt, is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Not because his cause was right, but because he was actually a very effective leader. Now, then people say, who are you most like? A little bit, you know, when I get very honest with myself, I'm a little bit like Walt Disney. I can't draw, but he was a driving founder. He believed when he wanted something, he pushed, often unreasonably. And at times he had a bitter strike against him in 1941 because he drove people crazy. And then I understand I've got a little bit of Zarqawi in me as well, and a little bit of zealotry. I wanted to say I'm more like Dr. King and Robert E. Lee, but that wouldn't be totally honest.
Hey, sir. Major Dave Schultz. I'm currently serving as a White House Fellow. First, I want to thank you, and I think the concept of, and you mentioned it before, that leaders can fail, but they're not failures, I think speaks volumes in today's era where heroes are committing suicide. I think it's important for our heroes to know that they can fail and they can get back up. So thank you for that. My question is, where to from here? So you've laid this out. You know, we're members of the best leadership institution in the world. You know, we got West Point. I mean, where to from here, and how do we rewrite the books of leadership?
Now, that is the million-dollar question. Because what we've essentially done with this book is, instead of writing a book and say, this is leadership, do these 7 things and you'll be successful, we've sort of thrown that out and we say, we actually don't know how to tell you to be successful. What we can tell you is how complex this is. What I would tell you, when I come down to it, is the things that I think make leaders most effective. I mean, having the right values is good, but being good or bad was not a test here. Some of the leaders we covered here were not good people, but they were effective leaders. And so we have to separate effective from good. But the reality is, I think in today's world, it's the people who are humble enough and empathetic enough to listen, to discern what the situation is, what's required, and then adapt themselves to that requirement, are going to be the most important leaders of the future. I don't think it's the person who has figured out what's right and they say, okay, this is how we do it, boom, and then they go through life and they go through different jobs. That way, because I think situations vary too much. And so I think that's going to be the most effective set of qualities a leader's going to have to show as we go forward. Because things are changing faster than ever before, that's going to be very important. If you look at sports, we looked really hard at including sports people. Vince Lombardi. When we think of Vince Lombardi, we think of sort of this driving, unyielding disciplinarian. But if you look at his history, he coached very differently in high school, college, and pros. In high school, he was tough on people. In college, he coached at West Point, very disciplined place. When he coached the Packers, he had Paul Hornung. That guy was drinking a case of beer the night before the game. You don't lead him the way you lead West Point cadets. And yet, superficially, Lombardi looked one way. Actually, he was pretty adaptable. Thank you.
Hey, sir.
I'm following who they're telling me selected. Patty.
Yeah, sir. First of all, you almost made me cry when you played the theme from West Side Story.
That was the idea.
My question is about, first, thank you for adding 3 females to your book. Thank you. And one of the things that stuck out at me as you were talking was that leaders see opportunity and they take advantage of it. Yeah. So my question is, do women lead differently than men?
We didn't have enough. Pat, that's a great question. We worked really hard to get as many women as we could. We looked at Joan of Arc, we looked at Katharine Graham, we looked at others. But we were trying to make sure we had certain other things of diversity. We didn't see that they were largely different, believe it or not. Coco Chanel was a tough-minded business person. She'll cut you and watch you bleed. Margaret Thatcher was this politician of conviction. Now, she was the butcher's daughter, and superficially, she looked like, you know, a nice little suburban lady, but she was hard as nails. So the answer is, we didn't have enough data to draw that conclusion. We just found that in those situations, and then your point about leaders taking advantage of opportunity, that is true. If there's a common denominator is they chose to lead or they accepted it. But in many cases, some of these people were sort of waiting at the bus station when the conditions they didn't create the conditions. Robespierre didn't create the French Revolution. Zarqawi didn't create Al-Qaeda and the extremist movement. Boss Tweed didn't create Tammany Hall in New York City. They got involved in situations and then they emerged as leaders, sometimes because they fought to do it, other times because they were there at the right place and right time.
Sir?
Sir.
General, perhaps a bit off topic, but I think not. Where does the current commander-in-chief fit in your concept and analysis of leadership?
Yeah, I know we'd end up there. Yeah, I'm kind of on record on this one. And so I'm not going to beat it to death. I think if we look at President Trump, he emerged. He didn't create the dissatisfaction that caused him to be successful in the election. There were already things brewing in the American political system. So he emerged from that situation. So I think almost independent of his personality, what we need to do is look in the mirror right now. Stop looking at President Trump or Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer or somebody else. Look in the mirror. Decide what we believe is the necessary leadership for our country. Decide what we believe our values are. And then that's what we will get because that's what we will demand. Stop waiting for somebody to tell us what to think. Decide what we think, decide what we believe, and live to that. Sorry.
Sir, a few moments ago, you brought up Walt Disney as a driving factor. You mentioned in your book that he treated people well, and for that, they would go the extra mile. In your research, did that resonate even today as people move jobs so frequently? And then any examples from your own leadership experience of how you were able to do the same thing?
Yeah, I was never accused of treating people well, but no, it was interesting about Walt Disney because when the organization was small, he was a very gifted animator, but not as good as some of his people, but he was a good innovator and he'd push them hard. He took care of them. He'd walk around. He knew the names of their kids. He'd pat them on the back. He had special chairs made for them. All these things to make his animators more effective. His problem came when the organization scaled. And so what happened is in 1934, they'd already been successful for a number of years in creating better animation, mostly short cartoons. But he gets the organization together in 34 and he says, here's 50 cents, gives everybody 50 cents, tells them to go to dinner, come back after dinner. And he gets them in a room, kind of like this, and for 3 hours he acts out an old German folktale. He plays every part. He plays the Seven Dwarfs, he plays Snow White, he plays the Huntsman, he does all of this, and then at the end he says, we're going to make this into a full-length animated movie. And you say, okay, what's the big deal? There had never been a full-length animated movie before. And so he was going where no one had ever gone. In fact, he was saying, not only do we want to see if we can make people laugh from cartoons, we're going to see if we can make them cry. So for 3 years, they worked to create Snow White. He mortgaged his home. He mortgaged his business. He mortgaged the intellectual property to Mickey Mouse to create Snow White. And then in 1937, when the big debut in Hollywood, it's terrifying because he's there, and if it fails, it's over. One of the reporters there described him beforehand as the 8th dwarf, nervous. Yet it's magnificently successful. So the company starts this meteoric rise in growth. They get money, they get a loan from Bank of America to create a new campus in Burbank. Bank of America's shrewd, they're my bankers now. They required him to make the hallways in the new buildings extraordinarily wide because if Walt Disney failed, they were going to turn it into a hospital. But now they've got a campus. They're spreading multiple buildings over multiple floors. He's on the 3rd floor. He's got moat dragons between him and people. And his leadership style doesn't scale. Suddenly becomes distant from his people. He becomes less approachable, less effective. And now he's not able to develop those bonds. And only 4 years later, in 1941, they have this bitter strike against him. And think about it. He had taken them through the Depression. He'd given them jobs. He'd created an industry, done all these things for them. And then in 1941, in his view, they're biting the hand that fed him. But he never really could scale. From then on, what happened is his brother Roy became the manager of Walt Disney, and he took on projects like Disneyland and things like that. And that's the part about being adaptable as leaders. You have got to be able to lead for the conditions in which you're, we've always say in the Army, you got to fight the war you're in, not the one you wish you were in. Thank you. Ma'am.
Good evening, sir. Elizabeth Gillis. I am in the Coast Guard and also a White House Fellow. My question for you is, all of the military branches are...
Where are you spending all your pay this week?
I'm not. That's why I'm here. I'm just kidding. All of the military branches are struggling to grow and retain officers and enlisted in competitive fields like cybersecurity. There's a number of fields. And so they're talking about importing people at higher pay grades with the specialties that are needed. And yet they're missing out on all the leadership development that gets people there in the very fields that have great challenges with leadership. So how do we address, knowing what are things that can help develop good leaders, how can we develop, either implant people with leadership skills that we need or grow and retain the people that we need in critical fields?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a kind of iconoclastic view of this. I actually think the military should be taking people lateral entry at every rank, and they should be bringing them in not just as specialists in cyber, but bringing them in to do anything. We've seen people come in pretty senior and be extraordinary warriors back in history if you study. We have a guild system in the military. You can't be a captain unless you're a lieutenant. You know what I mean? It's the idea. We changed that in wartime, but the reality is our mindset says, if you weren't at the wedding, you really shouldn't be here in the 4-star conference. And so I think that's a mistake nowadays. I think nowadays what we should be doing is taking people in laterally. Now that's very threatening to people that are in the guild. But I believe you can take people from the outside, teach them to do most of the military things. I deal in the civilian world now. I've been out there 8 years working with a bunch of companies. There are some people you could put a uniform on tomorrow and they could be a general officer and be hands down effective right away. And that would be value to the organization because fresh air would come in. It would do a lot of things that I think would be very valuable to us. We could bring in experts, but I would say if we just bring in experts, then they're always going to be viewed as sort of not real. They're going to be viewed as, yeah, but she's a cyber person. And I actually don't think that is the best approach.
Rangers lead the way. Good evening, sir. Captain Tyler Fitzgerald. I'm a congressional fellow. I know this wasn't the aim of your book, but if the Army was to adapt or adopt this definition of leadership, besides changing the FM, how else would you propose institutionalizing and training junior leaders to use this, especially in the context node, which I think would be the hardest to identify? Yeah.
First, I'd say that the military does a pretty darn good job of growing leaders. We, as I tell people, and civilian world always ask me about it, and I always say we get above average performance out of average talent. But there are lots of reasons for it. One, we spend an awful lot of time on it. You spend a factor of 10 times more on leader development. The military spent 10 times as much time on developing its leader than any company I've ever dealt with, to include GE. You know, they were famous for Crotonville, but that's a shadow of its former self. So the reality is the military takes it seriously and leans into it. And that's one of the reasons they do so well. Plus, in the military, there's no money. And when I say there's no money, what I mean is, in the civilian world, we think we incentivize people with their pay and their bonus. We don't. We just think we do. You're really incentivized by intrinsic things that matter more to you. But the money confuses the issue. You're not ever unhappy unless you find the person next to you is making more money. In the military, that's all off the table, so that's a big advantage. Now, what would I change about leader training? The first thing is, think about the times when you learned the most and you actually expanded. You sat in classes where you were taught values and behaviors, and they're not bad behaviors, they're not wrong behaviors, but they're not the answer to the question. The answer to the question is how you deal in difficult environments. Think of things like Ranger School. When all the things you've been taught suddenly aren't working, and it's 3 in the morning, you're dead tired, and somebody you trusted and loved and drank beer with in the basic course before Ranger School is suddenly acting like a total jerk. How do you deal with it? Because that's not in the book. And this is a peer. This isn't necessarily someone. Those are the times I think we grow the most. How about when you're Afghanistan and you're suddenly in a place and you're dealing with a warlord or somebody who you know is a questionable character, and you've got to make these decisions that are gray, they're not black and white, and they're not easy. Those are the times I think we grow the most. It's where we learn to problem solve in absolute periods of complexity, and that's what I would try to focus on. We sort of do it through experiential things now, but I would try to do even more of that because I actually think that's where you can both assess leaders the best and certainly cause them to grow. Thank you. 2 more. This better be great.
Yes, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Eric Rouse, Commanding General Staff School. With your baker's dozen that you have here, there were obviously some leaders that didn't make the book.
Yeah.
Which leaders would you go ahead and put into a second edition of this book, or would you recommend people to look into on their own?
Yeah, that's great. We had hundreds of names that we considered. We were very interested in Joan of Arc, as I mentioned, very interested in Katharine Graham. The one I fought hardest for and lost was Davy Crockett. And the reason I wanted him was because we have these pairs, genres, geniuses, reformers. We have Martin Luther, the Protestant Reformation and whatnot. But we have one heroes. And when we say heroes, we're not talking about whether they were heroic. We're talking about how were they viewed. And so we have Harriet Tubman, who is an extraordinary 5-foot-tall African-American slave who goes back into slave-controlled territory 13 times to bring other people out. Any time she would have been either killed or put back into slavery. And that's sort of stunning. And she's the real deal. But she's not, a big sort of stereotypical leader. She's a symbol. And then we have the Chinese Admiral Zheng He, who most of us didn't even know he was. He's a 15th century Chinese admiral who led the treasure ships. The reason we put him in is because nowadays in China, everybody knows who he was. He was theoretically 7 feet tall with a waist 5 feet around. Maybe not accurate, but that's what they say. But Xi Jinping uses him now as proof positive that the One Belt, One Road concept is not a new thing. That China is not an insular nation, but in fact it's a global nation. So he has become this symbol for, look, we did it before, this is just us being us. And so we tried to do it. I fought for Davy Crockett because, one, he was in my youth, born on a mountaintop. I can sing the rest if you want. Yeah, he was a real deal. I mean, he was a kind of a funny character, but he was a congressman. He was a heroic fighter. He was a pretty honest guy in most ways, but he became iconic. In the 1950s, he just became this larger-than-life symbol. That's what we meant by heroes, and so he was the one I fought hardest because I thought it resonated so much. So much, I bought my granddaughter a coonskin cap when I was down at the Alamo. One more. I'm sorry.
Excuse me. Hi, I'm Elise Anderson, a master's student at Georgetown. And in your research, these characters and the archetypes that they present, and in the people that you unfortunately didn't include in your book or couldn't, were any of them... Is this one on? Okay, great. out of these people, were they all innately, did they have the seeds of leadership within them already that were then developed through their circumstances? Or were there some characters that wouldn't have become leaders without the scenarios surrounding them in the first place? Is that distinction made?
It's not evident. You take Harriet Tubman. She escapes from slavery, and then she just feels this moral requirement to go back first and get her relatives and then get other people. I don't think she intended to be a hero. I don't think she intended to be a leader. But as she started to do it, she became one. She became a spokesperson. She became a disciplinarian. She became the person who made this process work. She wasn't just a tool of anybody. So I don't think she had selected initially, I'm going to go be a leader. Martin Luther the same way. He is this very pious monk in Germany. But there's great dissatisfaction with the Catholic Church. This was the age you could buy indulgences. You could pay for your sins up front, and then you're sort of covered. He and other people were very offended by this. So he becomes a symbol, doesn't seek it. He finds himself, but then he sort of stands up with it. So I'd say that most of these people find themselves in a situation for one reason or another, whether it's Coco Chanel or it's Albert Einstein, never sought to be a leader, but suddenly becomes the most famous man in the world in 1923. And so he suddenly realizes, here I am, and it comes with a certain ability to affect things and a responsibility. And he stood up to it. Now, there are some other people in history who probably had all those things and just didn't stand up to it, were unwilling to take the step to do it. I think the common denominator here is at some point in that process, whether they engineered it or sought it or not, they're in that position and they go, okay, it is my lot to do this and I accept that. And I think all of these leaders in one form or another then sort of live that sense. Again, some in a negative way, Boss Tweed with incredible corruption. But at the same time, he stepped up to fill the role that was open to him, the opportunity he had.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carter.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, John McChrystal, and thanks all of you. John McChrystal will be available to, we got a book, he's agreed to stay on and sign it for you. I think for me that, having known you for a long time, just your summary, leaders matter and leadership matters is very true. And I would project that in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years, when someone writes the next version of Leaders, Myth, and Reality, one of the chapters will be about General Stan McChrystal. Stan, thank you very much for this evening.